Welcome to Kinesiology 156, Sports Appreciation. Today's topic is Women in Sports and the Journey to Equality. So we're going to take a brief exploration into women's sports today. And as a father of a young girl, I want her to believe she can achieve anything she puts her mind to. This includes things that traditionally would be considered too dangerous for women or quote unquote a man's job or duty. This message has not always been a popular message of men to their daughters, wives, sisters, or women in general. But so to understand how there's been a change in many male views on women in sports, as well as how far women in sports has come, we need to look back to the early accounts of women athletes. And we can do that by looking at the Hurrian Games. Now, the Olympic Games were to honor Zeus, Hera's husband, but the Hurrian Games were there to honor Hera, who was the wife of Zeus and subsequently her sister. Now, as early as the 6th century BC, women competed in games similar to those of the Olympics, primarily the running events. Now, these games were officially organized by a group of 16 women who were all well educated and astute in politics, and later became the administrators of the further iterations of the Hurrian Games. So it is evident that even back in ancient Greece that women were well educated and politically active. But so now let's take a look at women's sports in the Asian dynasty. So fast forwarding to about 600 AD, between 600 AD to 1640 AD, there were sports in Asia, and women in particularly got involved in what's known as Cuju. Cuju is a game similar to soccer or football as it's known internationally. However, you can notice by the image that the goal is suspended in air between two posts and a hole is cut out in the net, and so the object would be to kick the ball through the opening in the net. There were professional leagues organized during these dynasties, and FIFA has even recognized it as the earliest form of football. Okay, now globally, during the 18th and 19th century, there were a couple key things that happened. One was the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution had many aspects to it, but as far as it pertains to women in sports, what really came out of it was that physical education was now offered for men and women, so they were receiving greater equal rights after the French Revolution. Also to note is that in Germany, an educator named Johann Gutsmuth, is known as the grandfather of gymnastics, was beginning to teach his artistic gymnastics to women and men. And these artistic gymnastics are the same ones that we know of today. Now in North America, we have, before the European settlers arrived, Native American women actually played in lots of different activities. And you got to remember, one thing to remember is that the word sport only came about later on in history. At this point, games were games, or they were considered activities. There was no such thing as sport. So they played modified ball games such as lacrosse or tole or even marbles and other such games. They also participated in tribal ritualistic games. So whatever was common to their tribe, women were allowed to participate in. But as it turns out, when the European settlers and colonists arrived, everything changed, especially for the whole entire culture of Native Americans, but in general as far as the view on women in sports. So now in colonial America, as the new settlers arrived, the new European settlers arrived, in the New England and southern colonies, it was highly promoted that women were to be homemakers and caretakers. And so these gender roles ended up discouraging women from participating in the sports. Now, the only women that weren't discouraged from participating in sports were those with more leisure time, and those with more leisure time were those of the white middle and upper class. So they were allowed to participate in activities. However, they were strictly recreational. They weren't really competitive activities. And along this time, there was also a myth that was being generated as that vigorous activity would damage the reproductive organs of women. So it was, a scare tactic to keep women from participating in physical activity. Okay, also in colonial America, though, there was not just the New England and southern colonies, there was also the middle colonies. Now, the middle colonies is where the ideology of women participating kind of took a turn, right? So in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania colonies, they were of Quaker belief, and Quakers believe that all humans have value regardless of gender or race, and all are equal in the eyes of God. And so, therefore, women had just as much value as men. So they were allowed to partake in wholesome sports such as ice skating, sleighing, walking, swimming. So they were not discouraged from being physically active. And in New York, now New York is interesting because they were the melting pot of the original colonies. This is also where we see our first Jewish settlers from Brazil. So the ethnic and cultural melting pot that was already beginning to develop in New York was evident then. So now the activities that women participated in this area were more for amusement and for competition. So things like racket sports and golf, handball, horseback riding, skating, and sledding, because obviously being on the East Coast where it's snowy and cold in the winter, were all types of activities that women were able to partake in. Okay, as time progressed and the pervading religious idea that sport and activity or physical activity in general was a bad thing and didn't help you in your pursuit of your godly and spiritual pursuits, that began to change during the Enlightenment period. Now, the Enlightenment period is essentially when science meets religion. And as scientists such as Ben Franklin and others of the time were doing their research, they came to the philosophy that physical activity builds moral virtues. And in doing so, I don't think Mr. Benjamin Franklin ever thought that he would be the topic of discussion when it comes to it's all about the Benjamins when people are looking to get paid for their sports these days. However, he was one of the founding fathers, not of just the country, but also of the promotion of activity and sporting events for not just men, but for women as well. Also moving through history here, we end up in the antebellum period in the early 19th century. This is when lots of different health reforms were taking place. But one that really took hold was muscular Christianity. Also during this time, we have the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and this was the mark of the first organized women's activism convention, and it really is what led to later on down the line women being allowed to attend higher education institutions, and also the 19th Amendment, which is the women's right to vote. Okay, during this time, Catherine Beecher was one of the original pioneers of really pushing for women to become more physically active. She had noticed that during her observations of wealthy white women, that a lot of them were suffering from ills and pains and aches and diseases that middle class and lower middle class and even the poor women were not. And that had a lot to do with their inactivity. The white wealthy women, it may not always, they had the opportunity to participate in activity because of their leisure time, but a lot of them were not choosing to. And so she was finding that the health of the lower social economic women was an indicator that physical activity was a good thing. And so she started a women's seminary where she promoted physical activity for your mind, body, and soul. She is known for her cult of true womanhood, which allowed for the idea that women could both be physically active and homemakers, so to speak. She was one of the first to come up with a physical education calisthenics manual for women, as you can see pictured here. This is one of her drawings and figures and instructions on how to how to perform an exercise holding two cans. So again, if you're cult of true womanhood, you could be in the house and still exercise. Also, you'll notice that the woman here is wearing what's known as a bloomer. Catherine Beecher was the inventor of the bloomer. So by her promotion of vigorous sports such as horseback riding and other activities in calisthenics, the fashion of the time was more of dresses and corsets and restrictive clothing, and so she came up with something that was less restrictive in order for women to be able to have a more enjoyable experience while exercising. Okay, now the Gilded Age comes about, and here's where we see organization, professionalization, and commercialization of sports. Now, organization, we have the codification of rules, recreational activities now are becoming more sports, and you also have annual season schedules between these organizations. The professionalization happened by sporting club memberships, so they were starting to charge people to be a part of these clubs, and that was helping them to pay players. And additionally, the commercialization, now the newspaper was becoming more and more of a viable source of information, and so the media coverage of sports began to rise along with things such as the railroads and the ability to telegraph. Information was able to be disseminated across the country more readily. Also, we see at this time rise of sporting good merchandise, those coming from companies such as Louisville Slugger and Rawlings and Spalding. So there was a lot going on there. So this is kind of the Gilded Age is kind of when it really the ball starts rolling downhill. During this time, the activities that women partook in, where you can see here, were working class women. The cycling was a big way of exercise. That was a mode of transportation. Cars hadn't been invented yet, so instead of riding a horse, they were now beginning to ride bikes. And middle class women were playing games like lawn tennis, lawn bowling, croquet. Those kind of activities, and then collegiately we see baseball becoming a more of a sport that women are partaking in. And here is a picture of the early days of Vassar College's baseball team, and the women's team existed there originally from 1866 to 1877. During this time, society was promoting women to partake, but eventually during this time the ideology changed back to, well, maybe women shouldn't partake in this type of activity. It was looked at kind of gruff and rough, and with all the different activities between vulgar language and what have you, there was all kinds of ideas that this was not suitable for women, so they actually cut the program in 1877, later to restart it, but kind of see how there's a ebb and flow of the way women's sports comes about. All right, now let's go into the progressive era of sports. This is the late 19th century to early 20th century. Here, during this time, is when we see basketball invented in 1892. Basketball was invented in that same year. Senda Berenson Abbott, who's known as the mother of women's basketball, modified the games or the game of basketball. And what she did is she basically took the court, divided it up into three sections, and had 9 players, but you couldn't cross a section. So the game was mostly about passing and teamwork, and it was for recreation and leisure, not necessarily for competitive purposes. And this kind of still held true to the ideology that women should not participate in vigorous activity. However, general recreational activity was acceptable. And then now we also know that this led to the development of professional leagues, and around the world we see that unfortunately around the world women get paid higher in other countries than we do here. So that being the case, we still have a long way to go as far as equality and in the journey of equality. So one example of that is here you see Brittany Griner dunking. That's something that would not have taken place in 1892, as women were not that athletically inclined. But here in the U.S., she earned on her rookie contract $62,000, but in that same year went overseas and earned $1 million. So the highest paid base salary in the WNBA right now is right around $100,000. So that's really low comparative to what we see the men's being paid at. Okay, so during this time, during the progressive era, also we see the advent of the Bloomers girls. Now these were hundreds of teams, mostly of women, paid to travel the country to play versus men's teams, and this gave rise to the All-American Girls professional baseball league, and that league lasted from 1943 to 1954. And it was a very popular event to go to and watch. But unfortunately, after World War II, when the soldiers returned, sports reverted back to be dominated by males again. And so these leagues for women kind of waned away, and we saw the male dominance reappear. Okay. Also, during the progressive era, we saw the modern Olympics come back. So the Olympics were banned due to quote unquote religious reasons back in the early or back in ancient times. Here we see, though, in 1896, the first modern games were played, but women were forbidden to compete. Just as they were in ancient Olympic times, they were forbidden to compete now. However, in 1900, we see our first women competitors, and there were 22 women out of about 1,000, so there was about 2% of the women were participants. And two of those women, two of those pioneers were Helena de Portaez, which is she was a team medalist in sailing, and then we had Charlotte Cooper, who was the first women individual medalist in tennis. Okay, now moving on, and we're going to talk about a few of the women's sports pioneers. And here you see Billie Jean King, and in the back you see Battle of the Sexes. There's going to be a movie coming out about her and her life and her struggle and her fight and pursuit of women's equality in sports, which we'll discuss here in a minute too. Okay, but first let's start with Gertrude Ederle. Now, she was an Olympian. She medaled in swimming, and she was quoted as saying, well, people said women couldn't swim the English Channel. I proved they could. And in 1926, coated in lanolin for protection against jellyfish in cold water, she donned a two-piece bathing suit, which went against the times of a one-piece for women. It was less modest than most people would have wanted. She donned some goggles and proceeded to become the first woman to swim the English Channel, and subsequently beat all the previous records set by men. We also have Mildred Babe Didrikson, who was an Olympic track and field champion. She played baseball. She was given the nickname because of her ability to slug the ball as the most prominent baseball player of the time, Babe Ruth. So she got the name Babe. But most importantly, she was one of the co-founders of the Ladies Professional Golf Association in 1950. So she had a big part in helping professional women's sports get a stage. And so we still see that league here today. Okay, breaking the color barrier. That was something, again, Jackie Robinson did on the men's side in 1947 when he became the first African American to play professional baseball. But here you see Althea Gibson on the left and Wilma Rudolph on the right. Althea was both a professional tennis player and a golfer. She was the first African American to win Wimbledon and US Open, and the first African American to compete on the LPGA. So you can imagine during this time, both African American and women in general looking for idols. She became one, as did Wilma Rudolph. Wilma Rudolph, who overcame childhood polio and had the scarlet fever and pneumonia. You got to remember back then pneumonia was a killer. She was told she would never walk again, but it just so happened she became the first American of any race to win 3 gold medals at an Olympics. That was in the Rome Olympics. She became a role model as well for the black community and around the world. Here we have Billie Jean King. Probably she's donned as the individual who had probably the biggest impact in women's sports. She was a women's activist. She was part of the Battle of the Sexes, which again is a new movie coming out where she beats a male chauvinist tennis player. His name was Bobby Riggs at the Houston Astrodome, which at the time was the biggest sporting event going on. And so, she was also the first American female pro athlete to come out as gay. Now here we got to talk about how women have progressed into their fight for, not progressed, but have continued to fight for equal pay. Here you see the Williams sisters. They are credited with carrying the torch of the women that preceded them, and they were able to lobby and convince the officials of Wimbledon to offer equal pay for men and women. It is the only professional event that does offer equal pay for men and women. Okay, so let's refer back to Title IX. We've learned about this in our high school and college athletics discussions and lectures, but here, just to kind of give you a graph of what's happening, it's the educational amendment that prohibited discrimination based on gender. What it essentially did is it's increased the female participation in sports incredibly. However, it's helped decrease the percentage of teams coached by women and the opportunities of women at the higher level of college coaching, this is, to less than 50%. So that's kind of one of those areas where you see progress in one but limitations in another. Okay, media coverage of women in sports. There's the stereotypes of traditional versus non-traditional. Traditionally, women have been viewed as objects, and sex sells was kind of the idea. There's research out there that indicates sex does not sell. It also, research indicates that women want a non-traditional stereotype. The research from the Tucker Center for Girls and Women in Sport has shown that women want to be viewed as confident, competent, and classy, not the typical sex object. Okay, this is a quick view of network airtime and the breakdown of that. Here it's only up to 2009, but between 2009 and 2017, not much has changed. And so you see that in 1989, there was approximately 4 to 6%, and that has shrunk to 2 to 4% of media coverage for men and women. So men are still getting the lion's share of media coverage, and it doesn't matter if it's ESPN, Fox Sports, or what have you. And this is interesting because 40% of all athletes are women. So it's concerning that we're not progressing fast enough and kind of equaling out that the coverage of women in sports. So there has been great progress, though, in some areas. ESPNW, so it's a women's site and it's all women's content. So that's one area of progress, as much as there are many more dedicated blogs and websites for women's sports contests. But we are still way off from where we need to be. Okay, USA Olympic progress. So you're looking at this chart, you can see back in 1896 there were 0 women, and now in 2016 there was more women participating than men. So that is a good thing, and it's a lot of that, again, going back to Title IX, giving women opportunity to participate in sports. And so the good news is the trend is moving in the right direction. So also to note is in 2012 and 2016 Olympics, women won more medals than the men. Okay, finally, the overall progress of women in sports. Well, we can take a look at the difference between men and women's sports by looking at USA Soccer. Now, women's USA Soccer has seen incredible success on many levels, winning the World Cup 3 times, and they've won 4 Olympic gold medals and 17 other championships along the way. That's compared to 0 championships won at either the World Cup or the Olympics for men's. Now, ratings are considerably higher for the Women's World Cup than the men's is, and women remain considerably underpaid compared to their male counterparts. So this is one good example of how women's sports is way more popular than men's sports in soccer, but yet they get paid considerably less. So, how long will it take society to continue to treat successful women as second-rate athletes? Okay, so again, how far have we come? There has been enormous progress over the past 2,800 years, and especially in the past 120 years. But there is still work to be done, as we can plainly see, because right now in the Olympics, currently men events outnumber women events, although it is the goal of the IOC to achieve a 50-50 split for male and female participation by 2020. So we'll see if that happens in the next iteration of the Olympics, of Summer Olympics. And so using the Olympic Games as a measure of global gender equality, we still have some work to do. So, in many ways, women's Olympic sports parallel women's progress in society. On one hand, there is great progress, while on the other, there are still limitations. So, think of the most recent news just as one last example of progress in society, which is the Saudi Arabian women being given the right to drive now. That's huge progress as a global equality measure, but there's still many countries out there that discriminate against women having education, voting rights, political rights, and basic civil rights in general. So here in America, we should have no question as to the value women bring to the table, and we should begin to honor our daughters, sisters, mothers, female friends, female coworkers, and the females around the world with the respect that they deserve by giving them the unadulterated equal playing field in sports, politics, business, and in every endeavor. So they fought super hard to be where they're at today, and we need to really take that into account. Thank you, ladies, for showing us what real toughness is. And ladies, as my mentor, 8-time national champion, 2-time Olympic gold medalist, women's softball coach, always told the girls, throw it like a woman. Meaning, don't try to be a guy, do it your way, as you can do anything as well or better than the guys. Thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful day.